Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College. I'm coming to you today with another video about middle childhood, that age group from roughly ages 6 to 11, and we'll be focusing on some of the social development in terms of their interactions with their peer group, and then also some elements of psychological development, such as moral development. So first of all, looking at the peer group. Peers are those who are of the same age group that you are. Uh, so when we talk about children interacting with their peers, they're interacting with others of roughly the same age. The peer group then becomes increasingly important to children in middle childhood. In middle childhood, peer relationships become less egocentric. The child becomes less self-centered in these relationships and more concerned about what others, their peers, are thinking about them. So you might ask, well, why are peer relationships important for kids in middle childhood? And of course, some of the answers would be, well, you learn how to develop your social skills by interacting with others and practicing those skills with them. You also continue in your emotional development and emotional regulation that you began working on even in your first couple years, as we talked about way back then. But also you sort of learn how to operate in a certain style of relationships that will be important ongoing even into adolescence and adulthood. So that sort of relates to if the child doesn't have interactions with their peers, doesn't have peer relationships, have they missed something important in their development? And the answer is yes, they have missed something important. Now, why? Well, consider this question. How do peer relationships and adult and child relationships differ from one another? We're talking about adult and child relationships, teacher and child, um, parent and child, coach and child. You get the idea. Peer relationships, of course, relationships with people your same age. So how are they different? Well, you probably say, well, your peers are sort of your equals, right? They're at kind of the same level as you are in terms of power in those relationships. But adult and child relationships, usually the adult is the one that has most of the power in that relationship, and the child is more or less follower or is subordinate to the adult. And so the child that only has relationships with adults, doesn't interact with their peers, is not learning how do you interact with people that are of equal status to you. And that's something they're going to need to do in their adolescence as they get a little older and into adulthood. You got to know how to do that. So it's really important that they have those peer interactions and relationships. Now, children also, as they're getting into middle childhood, they want to be somewhat more independent from their parents than they were in early childhood. And so they sort of create their own culture, if you will, that will set them apart from the adults. So they'll have certain habits and customs, like maybe a secret handshake, or they'll have, slang and lingo that the adults don't know. And so that kind of sets them apart, makes them feel more independent. They may choose certain hairstyles and clothing styles that the adults don't wear, again, so that they can feel that they're different than the adults, independent of them. And so buying into that culture that the rest of the kids are creating with you sort of makes you feel like you're a part of that peer group and that you fit in. That's why kids find that so attractive. Children in middle childhood then value certain things quite highly when it comes to relationships. One, they value protecting their friends. and not telling the adults exactly what's going on. You know, and think about this, you know, who's going to be more well thought of in, say, oh, you know, second grade? You know, somebody throws a paper airplane from the back of the room and the teacher's back was turned. You know, who's going to be thought of higher? You know, Johnny, who refuses to tell even though he saw who did it, or Maria, who you know, tells who did it. You know, people will prefer Johnny because, oh, he's keeping the adults on the outside and he's keeping us in the peer group on the inside. You know, so that's kind of explains why they tend to do that. Kids in this age group also value not being too different from your peers, because if you're too different in some way, the other kids may not accept you, and you're sort of ending up then being an outsider again, which you don't want to be. So when they ask kids in this age group, I think they were asking fifth graders or somewhere about that age, about what would they find more important. Would they find it more important to have at least one friend, or would it be more important for them to be popular? And most kids said, hey, friendship is more important than popularity. I don't care as much about popularity, but I sure want to make sure I have at least one friend. And so in order to have friends, though, you need certain social skills, or you may end up isolated. So this speaks to why it's important the child already has been developing some social skills to interact with others already in early childhood, so that they can begin to also make friends and keep them as they get into middle childhood. So when we look at how the peer group sort of stacks up in terms of social acceptance, then what we'll find in asking kids, they found most, um, when they looked at popularity, about 1 out of 3 kids was thought of as being popular by the other kids, about 1/3. About 1 out of 2 kids, they'd say, well, they were kind of average in terms of their popularity. And about 1 out of 6 kids, they would point to and say, well, that kid's unpopular. Okay. So that's the way it typically stacks up. Now, movement, though, from one level here to another is pretty common. You know, you can be popular one year, and by the next year, you're just in the average category. Or you can be a kid that's unpopular this year, and you might make your way up to the average category by next year. So that's real common. But that said, there's about 2% of kids that they found were thought of as being unpopular every year, year after year. Now, those are the kids we're concerned about, because those are the kids that probably don't have any friends, probably always feel like they're outsiders. They are at risk for a number of problems. Now, when we look at how do kids gauge popularity, who do they decide should be considered popular? With younger kids, you know, 6, 7-year-olds, that age group, you know, it's usually the kids that are kind and trustworthy and cooperative, and you know, they're nice to be around and you know, fun to be around, easy to get along with. As kids get older, though, and you get into that, you know, 9, 10, 11-year-olds, now there are some other things that come into play. And so if you're a boy uh, amongst that age group, well, the number one thing is being athletic. Is, yeah, starts becoming important. And what's the number 2 thing for boys? Being athletic. Number 3, yeah. So that's kind of, you know, as well as maybe, you know, kind of being a cool sort of person, you know, doesn't get upset easy. Now, when it comes to girls, the older, middle childhood, um, girls that are attractive, often. So attractiveness, nice clothes, good looks, that sort of thing tends to lend towards popularity. Now, interestingly, towards the end of this age group, often it's also kids that are maybe kind of arrogant, kind of aggressive, and maybe sort of buck against the authority somewhat. Those may be popular too, because kids, of course, want to be independent. Hey, look at how independent they are, you know. It's also interesting to see that, especially towards the older end of this group, you got kids sometimes that they're popular, thought of as being popular, but people don't really like them that well, but yet others want to be around them. Interesting, isn't it? Okay, so as we continue to look at social acceptance, then some kids, they are simply neglected by the other kids. And so it's not that the other kids reject them so much as they simply ignore these kids and they act as if that kid doesn't even exist. So, for example, every time that the kids pick teams to play a game, you have a kid who they don't get picked by either team. And the teams go off to play, there sits that kid. They simply passed over them and ignored them, and they don't get to play. That's really hard when you can't be included, not even considered good enough to be included. And so that's very hard on kids. Having said that, sometimes kids that are sort of neglected by the other kids, they might get through it. They've got a very supportive family. If they're maybe real talented in some area, that might sort of buffer this, but it's still really hard when the other kids treat you like you don't even exist. Now, other kids are rejected by the others. And we have one sort of pattern where the kid is aggressive, and that's why the other kids don't want to have anything to do with them. So, they're antagonistic, they're confrontational, and the other kids just say, get away from me. You're no fun to be around. Go somewhere else, So they're actively rejected. You also have kids, they're rejected by the other kids. They don't want them around because they're just withdrawn. They're shy, they're timid, they're anxious, and other kids just find that to be weird and don't want to interact with them. So get away from me. Now, you might say, well, that's really mean, but you have to understand maybe what goes on. If you interact with somebody and you sort of let them into your circle, you identify with them. And if they're shy and they're, anxious and withdrawn, they're scared of everything, you're sort of identifying with them, and you sort of has the sense that now that makes you that way. So in order to avoid that psychological feeling, then they say, we don't want you around. You're just much a scaredy cat, crybaby, whatever. Now, when we look at kids who are, I just abbreviated here, aggressive rejected, for AR for that, and I've got withdrawn rejected, either of these types of kids, often the reason they've ended up that way is because they misinterpret social cues. They aren't interpreting the emotional communication from others accurately. They have impaired social cognition. So, for example, you have maybe a situation where you got a kid that's sitting in their desk there in class, and they're just kind of slouching in their seat, and their foot is sticking out in the aisle between the desks. It's comfortable, no other reason. A withdrawn, rejected kid comes walking along there and trips over that kid's foot. And they get what? Very frightened by this, because what does that mean to them? Well, that means to them that that person intended to do that, and that they're planning to hurt them, harm them, and boy, they better be really concerned. And it really wasn't that. It was just the person found it comfortable to have their foot sticking out there. Or if you have the aggressive rejected kid come walking down the aisle and accidentally tripping over that, and they'll think, they did that on purpose. They did that on purpose to humiliate me, and boy, I'm going to get even with them now, you see. And so, once again, misinterpreting that, no, that they didn't intend to do that. It was just comfortable. Yeah. Now, both of these type of individuals also may lack emotional regulation. And the aggressive rejected child may have difficulty reining in feelings of anger, aggression, whereas the withdrawn and rejected child has trouble with anxiety type of problems. Many of these kids that are rejected by the others also have experienced some kind of mistreatment at home. Not all of them, but you know, it's going to be a little more common than average that something has happened at home that sort of has contributed to this sort of tack that they've taken on other people's behavior and how they evaluate other people's behavior. So one of our big concerns about peer relationships in children is the presence of bullying. And bullying involves what? Repeated, systematic behavior that's intended to harm others, and that is focused on specific victims. Now, bullying might involve physical aggression, physically hurting the person. It might involve verbal aggression, saying things that hurt, or it can be social or relational aggression, where the bully does things to ruin that child's relationships with others. So sometimes what we see is a child who is, they sometimes call them a bully victim, and that kid is a bully at school. Maybe though they're being the victim of bullying by older brothers or sisters at home. And so what are they doing? They're being aggressive to other kids at school to feel more powerful, because at home they feel weak, they feel picked on at home, and so it gives them a sense of power to bully others that are younger than them when they get to school. Now we also see the provocative victim at times as well amongst this whole thing. So provocative victim is the kid who will do things that provoke the bully. Now, this is a kid that, they'll steal the bully's pencil right before the test, or they'll, the bully falls asleep in class, they'll tie their shoelaces together. And they know full well the bully is going to really make them pay for that later. They do it anyways. You say, why in the world would a kid do this? Well, in many cases, what we have here is we have a kid who maybe is ignored by others. They don't get any attention from anybody normally. But you know what? If they do something that provokes the bully, people will notice them. Even if they notice them being victimized and humiliated, people will at least notice them. Yeah, that's how important our need for interaction and being noticed by others is. Some people will even put up with bullying in order to be noticed, and that others will just acknowledge their existence. What are characteristics of victims and bullies? Well, let's start with victims. Victims, especially in middle childhood, tend to be kids that are smaller and weaker than other kids, particularly if they're boys. They also may be kids that are not as verbally fluent as others, and so they're not able to defend themselves verbally as well as other kids. They tend to be, by the way, that's particularly common with girls, okay? They often are kids that are emotionally sensitive and easy to upset. Um, they often also are kids that lack friends. That's one of the key things. Yeah, often the victim doesn't have friends. What else about victims I was going to say? Victims often also are kids that are different. You know, the kids that has some physical feature that makes them stand out, you know, big ears or some weird colored hair or just anything, or maybe the kid that has to wear old hand-me-down clothes and they're seen as different than the other kids. Now, on the other hand, we can look at the characteristics of bullies. Bullies tend to be kids that, yeah, sometimes they're bigger than other kids, but sometimes they're just plain more aggressive, even if they're not bigger. They also tend to be kids that have a need for attention, and they have one thing that they almost always exhibit, which is a lack of empathy for their victims. So when we actually talk to them and get them to talk frankly about it, they will say, you know, it doesn't register with them the sufferings that they're causing their victims. It just doesn't, they just don't relate to that. Okay. Now, surprisingly, bullies often have many friends, or at least what seem to be friends, people that will hang around with them. And often they're socially perceptive. In other words, they kind of pretty good at understanding how relationships work. And sometimes they use that to bully others and play one person against another, things like that. They're often also socially perceptive. So in order to get away with bullying, they kind of have a sense of when the authorities are going to become present and they better back off, things like that. Um, so bullies then are going to continue to do this because they do get a sense of power as they bully others. And so what do we see as being some of the primary cause of that? Well, we could say yes, genetic predisposition towards a more aggressive sort of personality. Brain abnormalities can certainly play a part, although most bullies don't have really brain abnormalities per se. Most bullies, even if there's one of these factors, can learn to control their behavior with sufficient guidance. Okay. Now, also, we see with bullies frequently, they've had insecure attachment in early childhood. Many times they have a stressful home life, and sometimes they have hostile siblings that pick on them at home. And finally, you frequently find that the bully has had consistently a lack of guidance that would guide them into more appropriate behavior. So all those things can be factors. When it comes to the effects of bullying on victims, victims often find their self-esteem has dropped. They may become depressed. In some cases, we even see attempts at suicide, particularly some cases of cyberbullying on the internet, where kids relentlessly picked on a child until they really felt like killing themselves and even tried to do so. In some cases, it actually did result in the death of a child. Also, the victims of bullies unable to concentrate on their schoolwork, constant anxiety when they're at school. They may make efforts to skip school to avoid the bully or develop ailments that are either real or pretend. Okay, so they may pretend that they're sick, so again, they can go to the nurse's office or stay home and avoid the bully, but sometimes they actually end up really sick as a result. All the anxiety may cause stomach problems, headaches, all kinds of stress-related problems. Now, some victims of bullies may explode and retaliate against the bully. or sometimes they don't explode then, but you see as they get older into adolescence or adulthood, they still having the echoes of being a victim of the bully, find that they want to retaliate against anybody they can. And if you look at, some of the people who have engaged in mass shootings and so on, you'll find that frequently these people have felt like others have victimized them from childhood on, and now they're trying to get even with everybody else. So yeah, if we can stop bullying, we might be able to prevent some of these kinds of things. Now, you got a few kids who are victims of bullying too, that their way of actually dealing with it is, well, I'll show them, I'll become successful. And they do so as a way of showing that they can't be bullied. Now, when other kids see bullying going on, they found that other kids reported that they were uncomfortable with it, but often they would stand there and they would tolerate the bullying even though they felt uncomfortable. And you've probably seen this, all of you who've ever been to school. And you say, well, why is that? Why do they tolerate this? Why don't they do something about it? Well, there's a couple things. One is, okay, if you stand there and you tolerate that, and you watch this, and maybe you even kind of take the bully's side and kind of egg him on, well, you're identifying with that bully. And again, that psychologically makes you feel like you're in their place. And so it makes you feel more powerful to identify with the bully. Now, the other thing is that kids often, even if that's not the case, don't realize that they could frequently end the bullying by simply confronting it. Okay. There's one study that was done where they found out that if kids confronted the bully, asked them to stop, kids that were observing the bullying, okay, the bullying stopped half the time within 1 minute. Not 100%, but half the time. Now, that's pretty significant. But you know what? Kids often don't know that. They don't know that if you and the other kids say, hey, stop it, we're not going to tolerate it, that often the bully is going to stop because they are interested in their social status. Okay. So that's why kids don't intervene. Now, of course, a lot of kids are afraid they'll get hurt, but they have to realize that bullies tend to be primarily interested in focusing on their victims. They're not so much interested in the bystanders and making them suffer. So, if we tell kids, make them aware that confronting it often will stop it, it's going to be less bullying. So, can bullying be stopped? Well, in many cases, the child themselves finds a way to end the bullying. So some kids may do that. If they can simply ignore the bully, if the bullying is of the type that can be ignored safely, the bully gets bored because they're not getting an effect, because that's one of the things the bully wants. They want to get an emotional response. If they don't get it, they're going to go on to somebody else that will give them that response. Other kids may simply retaliate, fight back. And often the bully finds out that, hey, that's no fun. We don't want kids that fight back, at least not that are able to do it. Let's go find somebody who doesn't fight back, who's weaker. Also, bullies, children who are victims, may end bullying sometimes by diffusing the bully's anger. So if they can find a way to make the bully laugh and entertain them, the bully may stop with the negative behavior and adopt that person as sort of their court clown or something like that, that can follow them around and entertain them. Believe it or not, sometimes it happens. Another approach children sometimes find to be effective is simply avoiding the bully. If that's possible, well, then the bully is going to find other people to victimize. And here's the last one, is probably the biggest key, okay? Making new friends. Okay. The child who has no friends can readily become the victim of a bully. If they make friends, all of a sudden we have now others who can stick up for that child, and the bully finds it's not so much fun. Now you can't just confronting that individual, but you've got to deal with their friends as well. Let's go out and find some other kid that has no friends. You see, so sometimes kids are able to deal with it on their own. Now, that said, we're not going to just always wait until hope that a child can handle it on their own. And so attempts to reduce bullying in school have been tried. The most successful approach has been that which was devised by Dan Oes, that was referred to as the whole school approach. And so everyone at the school was involved with confronting bullying. So they sent pamphlets to parents about bullying and victimization. They showed videos to all of the students about it. They trained the school staff on how to handle bullying. That included everybody, all the way from the school superintendent on down to the custodian, and everybody on the school staff knew how to handle that and deal with it. They increased the supervision during recess. They had classroom discussions about bullying. They even sometimes did role playing where kids could understand what it feels like to be a victim, or what the experience of the bully might be, and what might motivate them and what also might demotivate them as they did the role playing. Bullies then were required to attend counseling along with their parents, and they made attempts to make sure that all kids develop friends, and so kids who were lonely were befriended. The end result was a reduction in bullying by 50%. Now again, you might say, well, 50%, that's not that great, but that's the best any program has done. And if you're the kid that made the difference for, you're going to say it's worth it. So that said, not all similar programs succeeded. Programs where they, tried to put the bullies together to sort of work with them in a group totally backfired. They simply trained one another about how to be better bullies. That didn't work. Special class for them. Increasing security in school often actually increased bullying. This is kind of interesting. And you say, well, that doesn't make sense. Wouldn't it keep it down? But here's the thing, okay? If you have more security personnel, then one of the things that provides is sort of a prison-like environment. And the school begins to look like prison with guards everywhere. And what happens when you put people in a certain role? Well, they begin playing the role. So if you make the school look like a prison, kids start to feel like prisoners, and then you play the part of a prisoner. Well, what's one of the main things prisoners are going to do? They're going to try to pull one over on the guards, and they're going to try to get away with things to defy the guards. And so that's one of the reasons that excessive security on school campuses can actually increase negative behaviors. And I think the second thing is often bullies are sort of thrill seekers, so they'll just, see what they can get away with in spite of the increased security. So successful programs then, like OS's program, included involving the whole school, intervention early. So even starting in kinder, if they saw signs of bullying, intervening then before it became a very solid pattern in the child's behavior. And then evaluation of the programs to make sure it was working and whether it might need to be adjusted. Okay, so let's shift to looking at the development of morality in middle childhood. So morality has to do with standards of what is right and wrong, what is appropriate, inappropriate. And I think we'd all have to agree that, there is a need in any society to have certain moral standards, even if we don't agree on all of them. But without that, we have a society that is nothing more than sort of animal behavior and sort of preying upon one another. So when kids get into middle childhood, because of advances in their cognition, as we saw in other chapters, now they're able to engage in more advanced moral reasoning. They can think logically, although they can't think well about abstract things so much, but anything that's more tangible, they can. Their moral sense is influenced by their peers, their parents, their culture, and increasingly, as they get older and older in middle childhood, peers become more and more of an influence. Kids also in middle childhood are more likely to behave pro-socially. In other words, following moral precepts that would suggest that they do things to help other people. They're more likely to do that now than when they were preschoolers and so on. That said, because they are increasingly self-aware, this is going to highlight moral conflicts that might occur. And here's an example. Now, maybe the child has been taught by their parents that it's not right to lie to people, but yet the parent, when someone calls, tells the child, well, tell them I'm not here. So the child now is able to recognize, well, there is a disconnect between what they were told is moral and what they're being asked to do. They're being asked to engage in a behavior that conflicts with their moral precept. And so this gives them some difficulty as they're trying to deal with that. In fact, they may point out to the parent, hey, you know what, didn't you tell me that? You know, so they begin to actually think about these things more and struggle with them to some extent, where they see conflicts in moral standards and their behavior or that behavior of other people. Now, children also, in terms of what they seem to be sort of naturally um, engaging in terms of morality, is they believe that fairness is important. They believe that's an important value. They believe inclusion is important, that everybody be included. However, if you look at their behavior, it's not consistent with that many times. Whereas they believe in inclusion, yeah, they may practice sexism. And the boys may say, hey, no girls allowed here. The girls, no, we don't want any boys in the group. Yeah, at that age, right? It's very common. And so you notice that, their behavior is not consistent with that. And they may not see that disconnect sometimes at certain points, especially early on. Now, in terms of fairness, they'll say, yeah, everything should be fair. But often their concept of fairness is everybody is treated exactly the same way. You say, well, isn't that fairness? Well, I'm sure you would agree that's not exactly fairness. In fact, think about it. If you have students and one of them is visually impaired and they can't see, should they be expected to read from a textbook, visually read from a textbook? You'd say, of course not. That wouldn't be fair. They can't see, right? But kids at this age, especially the earlier years of this, they may say, well, no, everybody should have the same standard. And, so they don't always see some of these disconnects. Kids also, at this point, become capable of developing ethnic pride and national pride without prejudice. Kind of interesting. It seems that to some extent, where these things are tinged with prejudice, it may be something that is modeled for them more than what they actually have developed on their own. Not always. I'm going to say, that's a whole nother discussion, but I say often, it seems to be more example than their own conclusions. Um, Environment influences moral values. And I'll give you an example. We have Paul and we have Yolanda. Paul, both of these two middle childhooders, if you want to call them that, both Mexican American children. Okay, Paul lives in Brooklyn, New York, and he lives in a kind of a tough neighborhood. And um, Paul he really doesn't try in school anymore. He's a fifth grader, and he doesn't try in school. In fact, he tries to skip school any chance he can get, spends as much time as he can hanging out with a bunch of older boys on the street corner who are sort of getting involved with some petty crime. And he's had a couple brushes with the law himself. He's not doing well in school. And so, yeah, partly it's his neighborhood influence, other kids telling him, school's not going to do anything for you. And part of it is, well, also both of his parents ended up in prison, and he's being raised by his grandparents who are really not able to provide him with firm limits and discipline. So environment is influencing how he values things morally. On the other hand, Yolanda, she is immigrant family, first generation here in the U.S., living in Los Angeles area. Also a fifth grader, Mexican American background, and she is excelling in school and doing very well. Model student, and her situation, her family came here and they had nothing. And so her parents encourage her to do the best she can at school, and they make sure to meet her friends and help guide her to choose friends that will be a positive influence. And with all of that encouragement, encouragement, she's excelling. And so you can see they're on different paths in developing moral values. One working hard to succeed, the other just kind of getting by maybe doing some things that really are not what we generally think of as moral. Okay, so in terms of then looking at the development of moral reasoning, Kohlberg was one of the researchers who really kicked off this research. And so he would ask kids to respond to stories. And he was interested in the reasoning behind kids' responses. And I'll show you how. Okay. So one example is the story of Heinz's dilemma. So he'd tell kids this story about Heinz, who's this guy whose wife was, she had an illness that she had to have a certain medication or she would die. And Heinz was not very wealthy. And so at one point, his wife has run out of her medication. He goes to the pharmacy knowing that he doesn't have the money to pay for it, tries to make a deal with the pharmacist to get the medication. Oh, and by the way, he doesn't have insurance that will pay for it. And tries to see, well, maybe could they loan him the money? He tries other people. He's tried everything. He's at the pharmacy. The pharmacist has already gotten the medication out. It's there on the counter, but that's when he finds out that Heinz can't pay. The phone in the back of the pharmacy rings. The pharmacist goes to the back of the pharmacy to answer the phone. His back is turned. Should Heinz steal the medication? Okay, so then the child was asked, should he steal it or not? Now, once again, Kohlberg was not interested whether they said yes, he should, or no, he shouldn't, but what was the reasoning? Why should he steal it, or why should he not do so? That's what he was interested in. Now, from then interviewing many children, he then came up with a certain levels of moral reasoning that we can use to look at moral reasoning. The first two stages he called pre-conventional moral reasoning, which has to do with before you actually can use logic. And so these moral decisions are based on rewards and punishments. And so the first stage of reasoning that he found, earliest stage of reasoning, he called it might makes right. So if you're strong enough to do something, then it's okay. So child wants another kid's toy. If you're strong enough to take it from them, it's okay. It's right in the child's mind, okay, because you can do it, all right? And that's sort of your most basic stage. He found then that kids tended to move from that to stage two, which you might call looking out for number one, looking out for yourself. And so whether something was right or not, whether it was okay or moral or not, depended upon how did it affect me, okay? So yeah, you know, if you could get something and it benefited you, okay, it's okay. It's all right, you know? So you'd say, well, what will happen to me? Oh, if I can steal the medication and I won't get in trouble and my wife lives, yeah, it's right, okay? Oh, but if I steal it and I get in trouble, oh, I guess it's wrong. Shouldn't have done it. You see, that's the reasoning, okay, looking out for number one. He then saw as coming in somewhat later what he called conventional moral reasoning. Now, the idea that here was some actual logic involved. Um, these couple stages tend to be revolved around social rules. Okay, so stage three, he called this a good boy, good girl, or nice boy. So kind of had to do with, well, what'll other people think of me if I do that? Will they think of me as a good person, as a nice person, or are they going to think some unpleasant things about me? That determines whether it's right or not, how people think of me. Stage four, then law and order. Okay, so this stage says, well, to have any kind of society, you got to have rules. And then you got to make people go by the rules. And if people violate the rules, well, then they ought to be punished. Okay, so and notice at this point, there's no questioning the rules. Okay, that's just the way it is. You know, them's the rules and you got to go by them. You can't question it. Okay. Now, he then found some people would eventually move on to somewhat more complex sort of reasoning that he called post-conventional moral reasoning, where now we're looking at abstract moral principles. And so it doesn't revolve around what other people think or do or getting a reward, avoiding a punishment, but rather moral principles. So stage five, he called social contract. Social contract should be familiar to you because it's more or less what our American form of government is actually based upon. So social contract is this. So we as a group of people can work together to decide what is appropriate, what is right, and what is not to be permitted. And so we can make the rules. We can also, if we choose, we can choose to modify those rules as well. Okay, so notice that's very consistent with how American government was intended to work. Okay, so social contract, yeah, to have a civil society, we agree amongst ourselves on how we're going to behave regarding one another. Now, stage six, which he considered the highest level then, was what you might call universal ethical principles. So this viewpoint, which would be arrived upon after much reflection and research, the person finally comes to the conclusion, you know, beyond social contract, there's just certain principles of the universe that that really really set what is right and what is proper. And if we study, if we search for them, we can identify these universal ethical principles and apply them then to benefit everyone. So that's sort of a little more abstract even yet, okay? Now, when we look at, here we go, sorry. One of the things that we can say is, okay, well, as you look at that sequence of stages, intellectual maturation and even brain maturation seems to help advance moral thinking, because kids, very young children, really can't really reason in terms of, social contract, or maybe even some of these levels, because their brain is just not capable of thinking that way. So that's important. But some people, they found, never advance beyond, well, they found not too many people would get to stage 6, not really all that many actually at stage 5, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. A lot of people don't even seem to understand how our government's supposed to work. Yeah. Some people may not even get to Law and Order, or they might still be, even as adults, primarily focused on might makes right or looking out for number 1. You say, what? Really? Yeah. Have a look at that. Okay. Yeah. Do we have adults who are at reasoning at the stage of might makes right? Yeah, we do. And you have some adults, and they're saying, hey, you know what? You got some money there, but you know what? If I got a good enough lawyer, and I can take that money from you, even if it's not technically my money, if I've got a good enough lawyer and I have enough power to take that away from you, then it's okay. That's might makes right. Now, or, oh, I'm your employer. And so, if I can get away with mistreating you in order to somehow advance and get some reward for myself, might makes right, too bad for you. Yeah, you have adults that actually reason at that level. Do we have adults that are reasoning at level 2? Looking out for number 1? Yeah. So, hey, what's in it for me? Nothing in it for me? I won't do it. Yeah. There are people that seems to be as far as they go. Yeah. We also may have people that as far as they go is just, hey, what are other people going to think about me? Yeah, even as adults. And then we have people that may not be able to go beyond law and order. And so their thinking may be, hey, you know what? There are these rules, and no one can change them. And so we can't even talk about changing rules to make our society maybe function better. Yeah, we have people that think at that level. Now, what am I sort of moving towards? Is this actually a set of stages that you go through stage 1, 2, and you leave behind stage 1, and then when you go to stage 3, you leave behind stage 2, stage 4? Or is it maybe more, this is a whole set of reasoning that we may actually sometimes adopt? Because you think about it, and often in trying to justify the choices that we make, we'll pull out one of these and say, I had to do it because of this. And so my thinking and a bit of research on this suggests it's not a sequential stage that you run through from 1 to 6, leaving behind each stage at a time, but rather it becomes sort of a moral reasoning toolbox that you use to justify what you're doing. Something interesting to think about. Okay, now a couple of other criticisms about Kohlberg's research was that it didn't really take into account gender and cultural differences in moral reasoning. So gender-wise, we tend to have two types of morality gender-wise. Boys tend to gravitate towards a morality of justice. And so, you know, you get what you deserve, okay? On the other hand, girls have a greater tendency to gravitate towards a morality of care, and that we should do for others what is best for them and what is caring for them. And so you can argue whether that's something about personality that's built in, whether that's something about morality that's built in, biological, or whether that's a matter of environment and how we socialize boys and girls. We could argue that all day, but you can observe that there is a tendency towards this, although maybe not as distinct as it was at one time. So to kind of wrap up this discussion of moral development, some implications of this for middle childhood is that this is a point in time when kids can develop a good sense of civic responsibility, responsibility towards others in their community. And so if we highlight this and get them thinking about that, they can become very responsible citizens. We also should know that parents can help guide the child in their moral development, and they can be a major influence, but also we should recognize that peer-related values tend to become more prevalent in the child's thinking as they move through this time period. And so often the parent at the end of this point in time is not the authority, moral authority that they once were when the child was younger. So a couple of things to know. All right, so a whole bunch of stuff. Hope I got you thinking on some of that beyond just knowing stuff for the course. And so we'll call that it, and hope you're having a great day. And so talk later.